Good evening. I hope everyone is doing well. In this video, we're going to start a new class, a class on the book of Isaiah. I always am excited at the prospect of reading and studying the book of Isaiah because it's such a wonderful book. It is such an important part of the biblical picture, and it really does some things, as we'll notice, that really no other biblical book, especially in the Old Testament, does. And so I hope that this is of interest to you as well. And what I want to do today is to get into a little bit of the background of the book of Isaiah. Really, there's two parts to the background that I'd like to explore. In this lesson, I'd like to explore the historical background to the book, because I do believe that the historical circumstances in which the life of Isaiah takes place has everything to do with the message that Isaiah preached. And then in the next class period, Lord willing, I'd like for us to look at the spiritual or the theological background and see how it is that Isaiah's message complements and taps in to the political situation in which he lived, and how the two of these are really meant to go together. So that's the plan for tonight's lesson and next week's lesson, Lord willing. And so we'll begin tonight with some of the historical and background features of the book. As far as studying the book of Isaiah, I suppose that some people might think, well, why should we spend a lot of time studying something like the book of Isaiah? Some people have said that Isaiah is the Romans of the Old Testament. Of course, we all realize that there is a sense in which Romans is the deepest and the broadest book in the New Testament. That there really aren't any other of Paul's letters or any of the other apostolic letters that go to the depth and the breadth that the book of Romans goes in explaining the plan of God for his people and ultimately for the world. It's kind of a unique perspective. That doesn't mean that it's not found elsewhere, but it's not given that depth or length of treatment as it is in the book of Romans. Well, the book of Isaiah is like that in the Old Testament. That there is a breadth of perspective, there is a depth of insight that is rarely seen in other books of the Old Testament. And again, that doesn't mean that no other books in the Old Testament touch on it. They do. But the biggest presentation of it is by far the book of Isaiah. As we're going to see, Isaiah goes from the time before the Babylonian captivity and speaks to the time well after it. His prophecies engulf a long period of time, even into the Messianic time. But beyond just simply the dates on the calendar, there is a picture of how God is doing things, of how God is working things, and how Israel is meant to be a part of that is only really kind of matched by the book of Romans in some ways. And so it has that big picture kind of presentation. The value of the book of Isaiah should be apparent to anybody who's read the New Testament. It is quoted literally dozens of times by the New Testament authors, so much so that some scholars have even said that the book of Isaiah is like a fifth gospel to the New Testament. Just as the Gospels are the foundation of what we read about in the epistles and the rest of the New Testament, so the book of Isaiah is a foundational kind of thing when it comes to understanding the New Testament. Exact numbers are hard to come by as far as how many quotations or references are there to Isaiah in the New Testament, but I looked at some modern cross-reference systems, and if I counted correctly, somewhere between 240 and 250 references to Isaiah in our New Testament according to modern cross-reference systems that are printed in our Bibles. I think we could probably argue that there are even more than that if we were to count allusions and echoes of the book that aren't particularly quotations. But even if we were to just stick to things that can be, easily or readily identified as explicit references to Isaiah, 250 is a lot. Remember, there's only 27 books in the New Testament, and for there to be 250 references to Isaiah in 27 books is an average of close to 10 per book. So this means that however you slice it, Isaiah is a very, very important book for New Testament authors. It becomes very clear as we read the New Testament and the Gospels in particular that the early Christians saw the book of Isaiah as kind of a conceptual map for understanding Jesus, his ministry, his life, death, and resurrection, his work, and the results of that work. That all of these things were explained long, long ago in the pages of the prophecies of Isaiah. And so the early Christians keep quoting the book of Isaiah because they came to understand that really what Isaiah was ultimately getting at was what Jesus had done in his life, death, and resurrection, and in the work that followed from it. And so this is one of the reasons that I love to study the book of Isaiah, is because it so enriches my understanding, not only of Jesus, but of the documents that are left behind by the apostles as well. What do we know about Isaiah himself? Well, his name means the Lord saves. And this is going to be very important because I think that in a sense this gets to the core of Isaiah's message. The man, his name, and his message are all kind of one piece. Isaiah was married and had at least 2 sons. So in chapter 7 and verse 3, we hear about one of them. The Lord said to Isaiah, "Go out and meet Ahaz, who is the king of Judah, you and your son Shear-Jashub." And then later on in chapter 8, he has a child with a prophetess, and the Lord says, "Name him Maher-Shalal-Hash-Baz." We'll talk about the names of those children and the circumstances of the birth of this one as we come to that in the book of Isaiah. But the point is that Isaiah is a man with a family. He's not kind of a loner. He is called to be a prophet as far as we can tell in 739 BC. As we've noted on other occasions, and Jared has pointed out as well, that the farther we go back in history, the less certain we can be of just absolutely nailing something down to a certain year. But given the kind of commonly accepted chronology that most scholars work with, the year of Isaiah's ministry to begin would be basically 739. We know this because in chapter 6 and verse 1, Isaiah says that it was in the year of King Uzziah's death that I saw the Lord sitting on a throne, and this is where Isaiah is commissioned to become a prophet. And so based on that, and based upon a lot of other things that we use to figure out dates in the ancient world, Isaiah becomes a prophet in around 739 BC. He preaches then to the kings of Judah. If we go back to chapter 1 and verse 1 in the book of Isaiah, it says that his ministry spanned the time of Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah. So he becomes a prophet in the last year of Uzziah, and his ministry goes through the time of these next 3 as well. We're going to see that in the first 39 chapters that his preaching is basically directed to 2 kings, and that is Ahaz and Hezekiah. An interesting thing about Isaiah is that he seems to have access to these kings rather freely. He does not appear to be a commoner. Given the culture of the ancient world and what we know about it, commoners were not accessible to the king or to his court members. And commoners stayed with commoners. So the fact that Isaiah can speak to kings, that he can be in the presence of kings, that he knows the counselors and the court members of these kings, seems to suggest that Isaiah may have been what we would call in the culture of the ancient times one of the aristocrats, one of the elite of his time. That he is not probably a commoner or a poor man like some of the other prophets were, but is likely one of the wealthier people who would have been socially accepted by the king's court and the king himself. Now, of course, that could be incorrect. We don't know that for sure, but that would certainly fit with the picture of Isaiah's ministry that is reflected in the book, that he certainly does seem to have free access to these royal figures. Isaiah preaches for about 38 years. He begins in 739, and we know that he goes at least until the year 701, because there is a very famous event recorded in Isaiah chapters 36, 37, and 38 that happens, again, according to the commonly accepted chronology, in 701. There is an old tradition that says Isaiah lived longer than that and preached longer than that. And if that tradition is true, then Isaiah's ministry might have lasted as long as 52 years. We don't know when Isaiah was born. We don't know how old he was when he became a prophet, and we don't know when he died. The ancients believed that men were fit for public service somewhere around the age of 30. And so if Isaiah was around 30 when he began to be a prophet and preached for 38 years, he would have been close to 70 years old at the time of 701. And that would have been a very long life in the ancient world. And so it's quite likely that Isaiah preached that long at least, maybe perhaps a little longer. The structure of the book is part of the exercise that I think is very important that we have to go through to understand the book. To just pick up the book and start reading it, of course, is one way to get into the text, but to have a sense of how the book is laid out and what the book is about to show us is, I think, something helpful. The first 12 chapters are about a very important time in ancient history for the kingdom of Judah that we're simply going to refer to as the Assyrian crisis. This period of crisis actually goes through the time of King Ahaz and King Hezekiah, his son. In these first 12 chapters, we're going to hear Isaiah's basic complaint about the people of Judah. We're going to hear the account of how he became a prophet, and then he's going to talk for the rest of that time basically about the situation in the time of King Ahaz and what Ahaz needed to do about the Assyrians. This is followed by chapters 13 through 23, a series of oracles against the various nations that existed in around the world in the area of the ancient Near East in Isaiah's time. Now, this is actually very closely related to the first part of the book, chapters 1 through 12, because in the Assyrian crisis, the question had become, who are we going to trust? Where are we going to go for help? With Assyria breathing down our necks, where are we going to find our protection? And Isaiah's message is going to be that God is your protector. And the point of chapters 13 through 23 is that the nations, their rise and their fall, are in the hand of God. And therefore God's people do not need to be afraid of the other nations because God will control them. In chapters 24 through 35, we get kind of to the heart of Isaiah's preaching and his judgment on Judah in some of the harshest language in the book of Isaiah. Now, there is some harsh language up front in the first couple chapters, but these chapters are a consistently drastic picture of the judgment that is coming on Judah for its sin. And then that brings us to the second part of the Assyrian crisis, this time during the reign of King Hezekiah. Ahaz's reaction to all of this was one thing. Hezekiah had a chance to do something different, to do something better. And so we have two kings, Ahaz and Hezekiah, a father and a son, who are basically presented with the same kind of difficulty. And we get to notice how these two different kings react to this situation. That's basically the first part of the book of Isaiah, chapters 1 through 39. The second part of the book, chapters 40 through 66, are really kind of unique in the Old Testament. What Isaiah does in chapters 40 through 55 is he basically addresses those who would go into Babylonian exile. Now, the Babylonians were not a world power. They were not a threat to anybody in the time of Isaiah. The Babylonian conquest of Jerusalem and the destruction of Jerusalem was not near. That was going to be a long, long time in the future. But it was so certain, it had been prophesied, it had been decreed that this would happen, that Isaiah, by inspiration, speaks to those who were going to go into exile to explain their situation to them. And then in chapters 56 through 66, Isaiah looks even farther into the future, and he addresses the situation of the return. And so there's that big picture that we're talking about, that Isaiah sees the plan of God not just for the next couple years, not just for the moment of his time, but for hundreds of years later. Of course, all of this is a mere prelude, as it were. It is a type, an illustration, or a pattern of something even more significant that God is going to do. That is not simply the rise and fall of kingdoms on the earth, but the rise of the great kingdom of God. We're going to save that discussion for our second introduction, but I hope you can see that all of this talk about politics and going into captivity and that it all serves a spiritual purpose ultimately as well. What I'd like to do for the rest of the time that we have in this video is to paint a brief sketch of the political situation in which Isaiah conducted his ministry. It is my understanding and belief that this political crisis has everything to do with the message, and that in our next class period, hopefully when we talk about the spiritual and theological background to what is going on, I hope that you'll be able to see that this precise time in ancient history was the perfect moment for Isaiah's message because of the politics that was going on in his day. So let's just rehearse briefly the political situation. Jared has talked about this situation in his class on the kings, and so we're going to be reviewing things that Jared has said here and overlapping. But if you're like me, it's probably not the kind of thing that you remember just the first time you hear it, so I think it might be good to review it just for a moment. Remember, Isaiah preaches from the time of 739 to 701. And this is the time of Assyria's last period of greatness. Assyria, if you're not remembering too well, is basically in this area of the ancient world. Israel is over here. Judah is here, right below Israel. Egypt is over here to the west. So you've got Egypt. Then going north, you have Judah, Israel, and then north of Israel is Syria. And then you have the nations of the north up here that are sometimes known as the Urartu. We have Assyria, Babylonia, and the Medes and the Persians off here in the east. And so the Assyrians are kind of right in the middle of the ancient world, as you see on the map there. Right before the time of Isaiah was a period of Assyrian weakness. From 823 to 745, the Assyrian kings had been weak. They had not been able to hold on to the conquests and the acquisitions of their predecessors. And this created a condition of kind of stability in the nations all around them. Because if Assyria is not on the warpath, as it were, attacking nations north, east, and west, then all of these other nations had an opportunity for about 75 years or so to be at peace. And so because there is no pressure from Assyria during the time of 823 to 745, things were going pretty well in the nations around. This was the time of King Jeroboam II in Israel and the time of King Uzziah in Judah. Now remember, we go back here to chapter 6 and verse 1, that Isaiah gets his call to be prophet in the last year of Uzziah's death. So Isaiah grew up during this time of peace and stability, both in the northern kingdom of Israel under Jeroboam II and in the southern kingdom of Judah under Uzziah. The reigns of these kings were relatively long. The conditions were stable. There wasn't warfare going on. It was a time of peace and therefore a time of prosperity in both kingdoms. But of course, as you may remember, the problem that comes with peace and prosperity for Israel and Judah in the Old Testament is that it breeds a sense of complacency. That when no foreign armies are attacking, when the money seems to be flowing through the economy very freely, then these people thought that, well, everything must be okay. God must be pleased with what we're doing. We must be doing everything right because God is blessing us. Now, of course, the prophets Amos and Hosea had come, and they tried their best to convince Israel that that's not true, that God is not happy with the way things are, that this condition of peace and prosperity is not an indicator that everything is okay with God. Remember, Hosea talked about the spiritual adultery of Israel. Amos complains about the lack of relationship between God and his people. And sadly, it seems like nobody was listening. As we said, Isaiah grows up in the time of King Uzziah. Uzziah is known in the Bible as a faithful king. He has an incident at the end of his life that's not very good. Remember in 2 Chronicles 26, he goes into the temple and he tries to burn incense like a priest, and God strikes him with leprosy as a result of that. But otherwise, Uzziah had been a pretty good man. And it's likely, I think, that this only made the problem of complacency worse in Judah than it had been up in Israel. Remember up in Israel that ever since the split after the death of Solomon, that the northern kingdom had been worshiping the golden calves. But they didn't do that down in the south. And in the time of good King Uzziah, I think it's very likely that many people in the south were thinking, we're probably better off than our wicked neighbors to the north. That even if it's a time of prosperity for them, that God must really be pleased with us down here in the south. And of course, none of this was true. One of the burdens of Isaiah is to preach to these people and tell them that God is not happy with the situation, that they are not committed to God as they ought to be, that the idolatry that persisted in this time of Israel's history was not pleasing to God at all, and that it was going to destroy their kingdom. It was a time in which people were indeed worshiping idols. And to remember back of some things that both Jared and I have preached on before, that idolatry is really, in a sense, the worship of self. That the worship of idols is self-interest. That you worship the idol because of what you want. And in times of peace and prosperity, when people are pursuing their own interests and seeking to get rich, this means that people like widows and orphans and the poor are being neglected. And so Isaiah talks about these things as well. There's all kinds of things going wrong in Isaiah's time. But the picture seems to be that nobody seems to agree with Isaiah, that nobody seems to think that Isaiah has a legitimate concern. One scholar has suggested that the emphasis in this time in Israel's history, in popular thinking, was on God's side of the covenant. That if anything ever goes wrong, that, well, God has sworn that he will protect us, that he'll fight our enemies for us. And that people had forgotten that it takes two to make a covenant. That God must keep his side of the covenant indeed, but the people need to keep their side as well. And what Isaiah does as he preaches is that he complains that the people are not keeping their end of the covenant, and that God is highly displeased with this. As we listen to Isaiah, the picture that develops seems to be that the foundational beliefs upon which Israel had been started, the covenant relationship with God and trusting in God, had become mere words and rituals. We're going to hear Isaiah complain in the first couple chapters about the empty worship in Jerusalem. And we're going to see as this political situation unfolds in Isaiah's lifetime that people really don't trust in God at all. Isaiah comes along trying to make this clear, that you think everything's okay, you're worshiping in the temple, and you think that because Assyria hasn't destroyed us or the Babylonians haven't come, that everything's okay. But Isaiah says, I'm telling you that everything is not okay. And I have to imagine that most of Isaiah's contemporaries, and remember we said that his circle of people seems to have been the elite, the aristocrats, the courtly part of his culture. It seems to me that most of those people probably thought that Isaiah was foolish, that Isaiah was being simple-minded, that you can't fight a nation like Assyria by simply trusting in religion. And they pursued other means. God's going to tell Isaiah about this in Isaiah chapter 6. He's going to be warned that I'm going to send you to preach to a people who aren't going to listen to you. And so even though Isaiah does not have to live the hard, difficult life of somebody like Elijah or Jeremiah who would come after him, he still is in a situation in which people are not basically prone to listen to him very well. We said that Isaiah grew up in a time of peace and prosperity, that this had created this sense of complacency and this false security. Well, all of that comes to an end starting in 745 BC, when a man named Tiglath-Pileser III became the king of Assyria. And with this man came renewed strength and aggressiveness to the Assyrian nation. The Assyrians had their sights on basically everything that you see on this map, from the Persian Gulf all the way over to Egypt and up into the north as well. All the land that is called the Fertile Crescent of the ancient Near East, Assyria wanted all of that for her kingdom. And when Tiglath-Pileser III came to the throne, that is exactly what he set out to do. You can see from the map here that this is that same part of the world, and how the arrows, the green arrows, indicate here the campaigns that he goes on during his reign, both to the east and to the west and up into the north, to subdue everything of the civilizations that surrounded him. Now, of course, here's the problem, that Tiglath-Pileser III ultimately has his sights on as far as Egypt, way over here. And in order to conquer as far as Egypt, he's going to have to conquer Syria, then Israel, and then Judah. And this inset map shows that area here, that Syria here, Israel, and Judah on the way down to Egypt. So this Assyrian aggression creates a political crisis for all the nations on the map here, but our attention is specifically going to be on Syria, Israel, and Judah. We read in 2 Kings chapter 15 that King Menahem is the king of Israel when all of this starts. And he decides that, well, I would rather be submissive to the Assyrians than try to fight them. And so we're told in 2 Kings 15 that he pays the Assyrians a great sum of tribute money, thinking that this will pacify the Assyrians and that they will not destroy his kingdom. Sadly, Menahem learns the hard way that that's not how the Assyrians are, that they want both his money and his kingdom, and surrendering to them only encouraged the Assyrians to be more aggressive. And so we read only 10 verses later in 2 Kings chapter 15 that the Assyrians come back in the reign of King Pekah, and they take everything from the Jezreel Valley north as Assyrian possession. All of the land of Galilee and northern Israel becomes the possession of Assyria. Well, the people down here in the kingdom of Judah are, of course, watching all of this. They know that their turn is coming, that the Assyrians are going to come further south as time goes on. And this prompts a great debate in the kingdom of Judah. The question is a very simple one. Should we submit to the Assyrians, or should we resist them? Should we be pro-Assyrian? Should we present ourselves as allies of Assyria in the hopes that they will not destroy us? Or should we be anti-Assyrian, pick up our arms and fight them? That is the burning question of the day. By the time of 735, when King Ahaz becomes the king of Israel, Ahaz has decided that it's apparently better to submit than to fight. You have to remember that there's a long rivalry between Israel and Judah, that after the death of Solomon, this kingdom was split in two, and the two kingdoms were constantly in tension with each other. And so it may be that King Ahaz is thinking, well, I should just let the Assyrians do what they want to Israel, not stand in their way. Maybe the Assyrians will think that this is a good thing for them. If I present myself as kind of their ally, maybe the Assyrians will leave me alone. I don't know if that's what he's thinking or not, but for whatever reason, he decides to be pro-Assyrian. Well, what's left of the kingdom of Israel and the people of Syria, they say that's a horrible decision. Because look at what you're doing to us. If the Assyrian king is going to be coming down from the north, which he has to do to come into the land, and if you're already on his side, if you've already submitted to him, well, then he's just going to come through Syria and Israel and destroy us. He's got no need to even deal with us if you've already made peace with him. So the kingdom of Syria and the kingdom of Israel did not like this plan by King Ahaz. And these two kingdoms allied with each other. Now, normally Syria and Israel were at war with each other. But now they made an alliance with each other. And their goal was to attack the kingdom of Judah, to get rid of King Ahaz, and force the people of Judah to join them in their stand against Assyria. Because the thinking is that no one of us can stand against Assyria, but if we put all of our armies and all of our resources together, then all three of us, and if we get Egypt involved too, that will put up this great front and the Assyrians can't come any farther. And so they launched this war against Judah. This is called the Syro-Ephraimite War. And we're going to hear about this in Isaiah chapters 7 and 8. Isaiah is going to have something to say about this situation. Isaiah comes along and says, listen, Ahaz, this is a time for you to trust in God. You don't need to be anti-Assyrian. You don't need to be pro-Assyrian. You need to neither submit nor resist. Let God take care of it. Isaiah saw that the policy of Judah that Ahaz had adopted of giving in to Assyria was really a policy of saying that we don't trust in God. It was a further step away from being close to God. And Isaiah said to the king, that's a mistake. And by the way, the Assyrians are not going to be a friend anyway. They're going to take the money and they're going to take the kingdom anyway. So you don't need to be getting friendly with these people. You need to be trusting in God. Well, unfortunately, Ahaz did not do that. While he is being attacked by Syria and Israel, Ahaz asks the Assyrians for help. He refuses the advice of the prophet Isaiah. The Assyrians come and in 732 destroy the city of Damascus, that is the capital of Syria. And King Ahaz is asked to come and meet the Assyrian king at Damascus and give a pledge of loyalty. Well, in 727, Tiglath-Pileser III dies. One thing you have to always remember about ancient Near Eastern history is that whenever a great and powerful king dies, all of the kingdoms that that king has control of believe that that is the right moment to rebel. That when the kingdom is without a king, that's a moment of weakness, and we're not going to pay taxes and be under the yoke of this oppressor while they're weak. And so when Tiglath-Pileser III died, all of these other kingdoms decided to rebel. And rebellions broke out all over the place, including in Israel under King Hoshea. The new Assyrian king is Shalmaneser, and he's not going to sit still while this happens. And so he turns his attention to the east and puts down some rebellions over here. But by 724, he had come back to the land of Palestine, and he laid siege to the city of Samaria and destroyed Samaria 3 years later. So right at the time that the siege of Samaria is ending, it appears that Shalmaneser died, and he was succeeded by a man named Sargon II, who came to the throne. Again, rebellions break out all over the Assyrian Empire because the king has died, and that's the time to stage a rebellion. And so Babylon tries to reassert its independence at the time. The kingdoms up here in Urartu stage a rebellion as well. And Sargon has his hands full in the east and in the north for about 8 years during this period. And so there is this kind of window in which there's about 8 years in which the Assyrians are leaving the east or the west alone. They're not coming back to invade Palestine and push toward Egypt. And so this brings us to the time of King Hezekiah in Judah. For whatever reason, Hezekiah decides that he's not going to be like his father. His father had decided to submit to the Assyrians, but Hezekiah says, no, we're going to stand against them. Now, Hezekiah goes down in the account as a good man. He purges the land of idolatry. He reestablishes the observance of the law. He holds a Passover celebration. The borders of his kingdom actually expand while the Assyrians are away for a little while. And starting in 715, a coalition forms to stand against the Assyrians whenever it is they're going to come back. Now, the role that Hezekiah has in forming this and helping it is not really clear to us, whether it's made by him or his advisors. The point is that all of these nations down here decide that they're going to stand together. Well, of course, the Assyrians come back. They send forces as far as Ashdod and destroy the city of Ashdod, which was acting as kind of the headquarters of this coalition. The leader of that coalition flees over to Egypt, and the Egyptians give him up to the Assyrians. So much for trusting the Egyptians in this scenario. In 710, Sargon turned his attention to Babylon, and then something happened that rarely happened. The king of Assyria was killed in battle in 706. So again, everybody thinks that there is a moment for breathing here, that the Assyrian king is dead. Maybe the Assyrians are going to be weak, and all of these kingdoms, therefore, again decide that they're going to reassert their independence. Hezekiah gets involved in another anti-Assyrian coalition involving Judah, Egypt, Edom, Moab, and Philistia. And again, the prophet Isaiah says, you don't need to do this. This is a bad idea. Don't trust in these people. Trust in God. The new king of Assyria was a man named Sennacherib. He put down revolt in Babylon, secured his eastern border, and then turned his sights west and set his aim ultimately on the capital city of Jerusalem. His army came down from the north, and he came through the foothills of Judea. And the picture that we get from the Assyrian records is that he basically systematically captured and destroyed the major cities along the coast and going through the foothills here. He destroyed Ekron and Ashkelon, destroyed the fortified cities of Judah, including the famous city of Lachish, and then brought an advance force of his army up to Jerusalem. So now the Assyrians had come all the way to the kingdom of Judah, and Hezekiah was faced with a great choice. Should I turn to Egypt? Should I ask the Assyrians for leniency? Or should I trust in God? Of course, Isaiah says, you should trust in God. And in that famous incident that Jared has recounted already in the study of the Kings, Hezekiah decides to do so. God destroys the Assyrian army that had come against him. Later on, we know that the Assyrian army, the rest of the Assyrian army, was defeated in a battle at Egypt. That picture is the backdrop for Isaiah chapters 1 through 39. All of that political intrigue with the nations, with Assyrian aggression, and the Assyrians coming and withdrawing and coming and withdrawing, and should we or should we not give in to them? Who shall we seek? All of that political instability, all of that fear is the context in which Isaiah preached his message. You can see that it was a time in which a lot of people really didn't know what to do, and Isaiah preached faith in God. So that's where we're going to leave off for this lesson. In our next lesson, as I said, what I'd like to do is I would like to explore the spiritual or the theological side, because there's another piece to this background that we find in the writings of Isaiah and in the Bible in general that has everything to do with the activity of these kingdoms and the aggression of Assyria and Isaiah's message about faith. And so I'm looking forward to that study next week, Lord.